Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the final event of our 23rd annual Jewish Book Festival, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. My name is Barbara Levinson, and I'm the co-chair of this event this evening, along with Wynn Langer and Linda Mazur, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and commitment to create this kind of a book festival. So before we start our program, I'd like to acknowledge some people, starting with our hardworking committee members, our advanced readers, the Federation staff, and especially our coordinator, Kim Banaji, who is coordinating all the way from Israel. Oy. The Jewish Book Council in New York, from which we choose authors and books, our behind the scenes tech wizard, Jake Tavel, and the Literary Circle members whose financial support make this entire event possible. We have a special treat for you tonight to kick off our final author event for 2021. Amy Rowe, who wowed us with a wonderful tribute to Carl Sagan 2 years ago, has agreed to and made an arrangement of an homage of clocks and time. So sit back, gather your favorite drink and snack, and be prepared to tap your toes as we partake of this music interlude from Amy Rowe and Marlon Martinez, who is on bass, who have put together a wonderful string of ticking clock music for you to enjoy. Thank you, Amy and Marlon. Now that you have set the mood, let me introduce our author for tonight's presentation. This evening's program will be a presentation by author Ira Rosen. He will be followed by a question and answer period. If you have questions for Ira, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions anytime. Ira Rosen has produced some of the most memorable and groundbreaking stories for 60 Minutes for 25 years. He was a senior producer at Primetime Live with Diane Sawyer. He won 24 national Emmys, 4 DuPont Awards, 2 RFK Awards, and 2 Peabodys for his work. Ira is the co-author of The Warning, The Accident at 3 Mile Island. Good evening, Ira. We are so happy that you can join us this evening.
Thank you so much for that wonderful music interlude. That was great. I really enjoyed it. Are you sure that we can we ask for an encore for it? They were great, and kudos to them. Um, Thank you so much for having me here tonight. This is a great honor, and I wish I was there in person. I know at one point we talked about doing this in person, but I'm glad we were able to make contact this way. This is really wonderful, a wonderful moment. So let me give you a little bit of a background on 60 Minutes. For 53 years, 60 Minutes has been the show that most Americans have relied on to stay informed. Its willingness to challenge authority impacted the public consciousness. It invented television investigative journalism, including the use of hidden cameras and confrontational interviews to tell its stories. And today, there's a dilution of news with thousands of potential news sources. But in its heyday, the only TV news magazine that was out there was 60 Minutes, with a viewership that each week rivaled that of the Super Bowl. That reach gave me as a producer superpowers to convince whistleblowers, con men, mob bosses to tell their stories. We got the wrongfully convicted out of jail. We exposed the plight of farm workers. We exposed the conditions inside VA hospitals, exposed crooked congressmen. It was kind of like being Superman. And we were crusaders and muckrakers, and we were appreciatively referred to as the fifth branch of government for righting the wrongs of society and giving during a time when our work was not dismissed as fake news. But now things kind of have changed. The art form that when I was there was the art form created by Don Hewitt. And that art form was tell me a story. And what Don wanted us to do was to do stories where we would do something called doing a story that created a Hey Mildred moment. And what is a Hey Mildred moment? A Hey Mildred moment is two couch potatoes are sitting watching 60 Minutes, or one couch potato is, and they scream out, "Hey Mildred, come on over here. You're not going to believe what you see." And the great 60 Minute stories of the time had a point and counterpoint. In fact, they actually had the end of the show, which was a point counterpoint with Shane Alexander, who's one of the hosts of it. And so let's say you did a story, and one of my favorite stories that we did back in those days was a story on driving while old. And what is driving while old? So I'm right now speaking to you from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where a lot of old people are driving. So a lot of them shouldn't really be having licenses. But if you take their license away, you destroy their lives. So Harry Reisner did a story, Driving While Old. So on one hand, you see these people, you say, I don't want them on the road. Don't get them anywhere near me. Keep them away from me. But then you see what would happen if you take their license away, and their life would be effectively over. And so you have the two couch potatoes sitting there and saying, give them their license. No, no, take it away. Give them the license. And that created a conversation by viewers to engage almost with the show that they're watching. Today, everything is sort of a point of view. Either you turn on, especially cable, you turn on cable to have your views reinforced. So if you're a pro this or anti this, you have a station and a network you can go to that will reinforce your ideas. And when I was working there, and I hate to say when I was there, but it really was, when I was there at 60 Minutes, you had something which created a debate. It was almost like a court case, a good court case that created the story. And what does a producer do at 60 Minutes? So, a producer is the person, there's about 24 of us on 60 Minutes, and we find the stories, we research the stories, we write the stories, we write the questions for the correspondent, and we ultimately put the stories together. And what that does, it's not that the correspondent can't do it, is that we're doing maybe 4 or 5 stories a year, while the correspondent is maybe doing 25 or 20. And so they can't get immersed in the details of the story the way a producer can. So we're the ones who kind of put this together. And a lot of people ask me, how did you get your beginning at 60 Minutes? Well, for me, it was a phone call that came to my great Jewish mother's home in Fresh Meadows, Queens. And I graduated Cornell, and I was bouncing around the country from place to place and from job to job. I worked actually in California for a bit of time, in Fresno and Long Beach. And I was really just moving around, and I was kind of grifting almost. And then I got a job at Channel 9 TV in New York City, and I did a story that 60 Minutes executive producer Don Hewitt saw and liked. And I want to just read you a little bit about what happened after he saw the story. And this is chapter 1. This is the book, Ticking Clock. That's the way I looked at the time. Everyone could sort of see. I had the 70s hairdo and a little mustache and everything. And the skinny tie, look at the skinny tie. You see the skinny tie? So anyway, this is what happened that day. My path to 60 Minutes began on June 1980 when the phone rang at my parents' home in Fresh Meadows, Queens. Is this the home of Ira Rosen? The caller inquired. Yes. Who are you? My mother replied. I'm Don Hewitt, executive producer of 60 Minutes. Oh, yes, I've read about you, my mother replied. You have a lovely wife. Thank you. What are you doing? I'm making a kugel, my mother said. A kugel? God, I haven't had a good kugel in a long time, Hewitt said. You come visit me, I'll give you a kugel, my mother offered. My mother, Ethel, was the quintessential Jewish mother, nagging, judgmental, and someone with all the answers. Actually, I'm looking for Ira, Hewitt said. I'd like to see if he'd be interested in being a producer for 60 Minutes. Oh, he's not interested. He's got a good job, my mother said. Thanks anyway. I listened from across the room to the conversation, and I asked my mother who was on the phone. Don Hewitt of 60 Minutes. He wanted to offer you a job, but I told him you already had one, she said. How many jobs do you need? I leapt from the chair and raced to the phone to call Hewitt back. Even though a few minutes had passed, he immediately picked up the phone. He was laughing. I don't know about you, but I like your mother. If you don't want the job, tell her it's hers. Needless to say, I wanted the job. So that day, the next day, I went in to see Don Hewitt at 60 Minutes. And I had learned the art of storytelling from working in the Catskill hotels. Catskill hotels were the Jewish Catskills in New York, Concord, Grossinger's, and I worked in a hotel called the Homowack Lodge. And as I was the tennis pro, and as the tennis pro at the Homowack Lodge, you had to work the nights in the nightclubs. And so I would work the nights for Jan Murray and Red Buttons, and of course, Henny Youngman. Now, Henny Youngman had the great joke, take my wife, please. Or, I'm going to take my wife to a place she's never been before. Pause, the kitchen. Now, that joke has a beginning, middle, and end. It has a punchline. And it's all told in a very short, concise way. Well, that's what a great story is. A great story has a beginning, middle, and end, a point of view, and a punchline, all told in a few words. And so when I told this to Hewitt, he immediately said, that's how I learned how to tell stories too. And so we had a common bond. But he said, it doesn't matter if I like you, he has to like you. And the he was referring to was Mike Wallace. Now, Mike Wallace at the time was the top correspondent in network TV. 60 Minutes at the time was the number one show in the country, and he was the number one guy. And he suddenly, I find myself at the age of 26 being walked into Mike Wallace's office to be told or asked that I was going to be his producer. So he took a look at my resume, was greatly unimpressed. And he said to me, I know what I can do for you. What can you do for me? And it was a great question. And I noticed he had a tennis ball in the corner of his office. And I said, you play tennis? And he said, what's it to you? And I said, well, I used to be on the Cornell tennis team. And he said to me later, that clinched the job for me, because he said if I didn't work out as a producer, he could get 6 months of good tennis out of me before firing me. So Hewitt comes back in the office and he said, what do you think, Mike? Give the kid a chance? So he kind of shrugged. And so they gave me a contract, and I became Mike Wallace's producer on 60 Minutes. And here's what happened when I told my mom about that. I walked out of the office dazed. I'd come from covering high school sports in Fresno, California, to becoming Mike Wallace's producer on the hottest show on TV. Not only was Mike the star, but I'd become the youngest producer that they had ever hired. I called my mother to tell her, Mom, I was just hired to be Mike Wallace's producer on 60 Minutes. Without missing a beat, my mom said, Mike Wallace? He's so old. Why can't you work for Dan Rather? Anyway, I think we all have a Jewish mother like that. By the way, anybody who tonight, and it's a one-night special, buys the book, gets my mother's kugel recipe, and I'll send it to Barbara, and Barbara will make sure that anybody who buys the book will get the kugel recipe. And to answer the question I was asked at the Jacksonville JCC, it is not parva. So I just want you to know it has some chicken fat in it, but it's really amazing. So anyway, I was hired as Mike's producer on 60 Minutes, and I found myself suddenly traveling the planet, doing story after story. And one of the stories that actually I didn't do was a story involving Marlon Brando. And I think everyone remembers Marlon Brando, the great actor. And I had done a story on Joe Bonanno, the gangster. And I wanted to use a little bit of The Godfather. And normally you just call the studio and they say, sure, go ahead. Suddenly I got a phone call from Marlon Brando. And he's saying, tell me, is Joe Bonanno okay with this? I said, yeah, Joe's fine with it. It's all right. But he and I began a long relationship over the phone. And Brando would talk Yiddish to me. And he learned Yiddish from Stella Adler, who was his acting coach. And so he called me up, Bismachsta, Gunish. We'd have a back and forth. And imagine talking Yiddish to Marlon Brando, right? How many jobs give you the opportunity to do that? And after a while, I was trying to convince him to go on camera to do a profile. And he was a recluse at the time. And I said, Marlon, it's going to be a great profile. By the way, I'd call him up on his birthday and I'd say, happy birthday, Marlon. He and I were born on the same day. And he said, what is it with you at birthdays? Trees don't celebrate birthdays. Animals don't celebrate birthdays. I'm going to do nothing special. I said, Marlon, I'm just calling you up to wish you a happy birthday. And he said, I'm going to do nothing special. After a while, after these back and forths, he finally agreed to a meeting. And so Mike Wallace and I were in Beverly Hills Hotel. And he picks us up. Marlon Brando comes and he picks us up in a white Rolls Royce. He's wearing a beautiful white suit. And Mike gets into the front. I get in the back. And Mike says, I'm a little nervous. Marlon Brando says, I am too. And I said, God, this is going so well. Meanwhile, Brando starts driving, and he's driving down Mulholland Drive. And he's running every single red light. I said, Marlon, what are you doing? And he said, you're a man. Don't let a machine tell you what to do. Be a man. And I said, oh, boy. So somehow we made it to this restaurant in the valley. And we get out, small little Italian place. And Mike can't help himself. And Marlon can't help himself. So Marlon says to Mike first, you're a great actor. I just want to tell you, I've admired your abilities over the years, the way you raise your eyebrow and hold your glasses. And Mike says, I'm not an actor, I'm a journalist. Oh, Marlon says, oh, stop it. you're a great, I mean, the way you conduct your interviews, it's acting at its best. So Mike decides to punch back. And he says, how did you get so fat? And Brando doesn't hesitate. He says, I go to Baskin and Robbins. I can't decide what flavor I want. So I get a quart of every flavor they have and I bring it home. I end up eating it all. At which point, Mike says, I'm 67 years old. I don't need to show America what an asshole you are. Why don't we be friends? At which point I look at him and I said, are you kind of crazy? And Brando grabs his hand and says, great, now I can relax. And to this day, I don't quite understand why Mike did what he did. But we finished the dinner, and Brando doesn't talk to me very much at the end. And we finally had one more final conversation over the phone. Brando calls me up and he said, you play the stock market? I say a little bit. I don't have much money. He said, well, let me give you a tip. What's that? It's a company called Apple. I said, I never heard of it. Trust me, you will. So I go and tell Wallace about this. And Wallace says, you're going to buy the stock. I said, are you crazy? Why would I take a stock tip from a guy who can't decide what flavor ice cream he wants? So anyway, that's one that got away on a number of levels. But one story that I kind of loved, and I think everybody kind of remembers this person, was Andrei Sakharov. And Andrei Sakharov was the great inventor of won the Nobel Prize and was the great dissident in Russia. And we got on an airplane and we just went to Moscow and we were doing a profile of Edward Teller. And Teller would have wanted us to interview Sakharov. So, we had no budget back then. We could just basically go anywhere we wanted to at a drop of a dime. Our lives were in the best hotels. We flew first class. And so Wallace and I go out to Moscow. We meet up with Sakharov, and his wife, Elena Bonner, answers the door and says, listen, if you're going to take him for an interview, you make sure you bring him back by 3:00. And Mike says, yes, Mrs. Bonner, we will. And it was one of the great, their apartment in Moscow, and this was in the mid to late 80s, was filled with the dissidents, the Jewish dissidents in the city. And they were the ones who would end up radicalizing the society, and they would be the ones who would help launch the movement of Soviet Jews to Israel. And they were all there, and they knew it was safe harbor because the Russian affiliates were not going to mess with their Nobel Prize winner. So it was an incredible little scene. But anyway, we go and interview Sakharov, and Sakharov tells us, by the way, that the Rosenbergs did not provide them with the key information or in fact any important information that helped them solve the nuclear riddle. The way they did it was after US above ground testing, the fallout would pass over Siberia. And they would then, when the fallout would then come down onto the ground, into the snow, the Soviets would gather the fallout in the snow and then break down the residuals and figure out how the US bombs were made. It's a remarkable moment that he told us this. By the way, it was so remarkable that the CBS News translator there didn't even want to translate the story. But anyway, we did the story and Mike had a good time, and we're on Red Square and Mike's taking pictures with Sakharov. And we finally bring him back, but now we bring him back at 3:45. And true to her word, Elena Bonner locked her husband out of the apartment. Apparently they only had one key. And so he's now suddenly sitting on the stoop. And I said, Mike, you can't leave Dr. Sakharov here. It's the middle of winter. And he's, this is the guy who survived Gorky. And he says, no, I'm fine. Go. Anyway, it turned out later that was the kind of last time I would see Sakharov. But being a 60 Minutes producer, it got you to meet people like that. And by the way, just one small aside, I have 3 kids. And another kind of added benefit, I did bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah videos of my kids. And the people who tracked the videos were Diane Sawyer, Charlie Gibson, and of course, Mike Wallace. So that's a pretty good threesome to track your kids' bar mitzvah videos. So anyway, one of the stories that I always also love to do was stories about Congress. And I did a story, and it's germane today. I did a story called the Stock Act. And the Stock Act was something which would have made it illegal for congressmen and senators to buy stocks based on inside information that they learn in committee hearings or in classified documents. And believe it or not, it was totally legal for them to do. So there was a piece of legislation that had only 12 sponsors that would have changed that. So we did an investigation and we found out that a number of congressmen and senators were selling short stocks at the time that the US economy was about to crater. And they were getting briefed by Secretary of Treasurer Paulson that the economy was about to crater. And literally within an hour, they shorted their stock portfolios. And so we exposed this, and the story had kind of an amazing impact on Washington. And it went from 13 sponsors to over 200. It was passed the U.S. Senate in the fastest time I think any bill had ever passed. Barack Obama spoke about it in the State of the Union, and when it was finally passed and it was being signed, I was invited to sit in front of Barack Obama when the bill was signed. It was really amazing. I said, God, this is what being a journalist is all about. You can affect change, and this is great. However, 2 months after the bill was signed, they rescinded the whole piece by voice vote, no recorded vote, voice vote. And then it became business as usual. So right before the COVID outbreak, senators were shorting the stocks after getting briefings from health officials. And a number of senators shorted their stocks, and it became business as usual. So it got me thinking, you know, I want to do stories about people who tell the truth, who are honorable, which is one of the reasons I started doing stories about gangsters. Because once when gangsters decide to come forward and tell their truth and tell their stories, it's amazing how honest they could actually be. And probably my favorite gangster who I ever did a story on was John Gotti Jr. And John Gotti Jr. ran the Gambino crime family. He took it over from his father, who, of course, was the Dapper Don, and he took it over from him. And when I first met him, he was on trial in federal court in New York. And when I saw him, I waved to him and I started winking at him. And so he turns to his lawyer, Charlie Carnesi, and he said, "Who's that guy winking at?" He said, "That's the 60 Minutes guy. Wants to do an interview with you." And he said, "Listen, ain't doing no interviews with anybody who winks at me, and I ain't doing no interviews with 60 Minutes. So as John tells the story, he says, I started to court him like a bride. And people ask me, how long does it take to produce a story? It took me 4 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 years to ultimately get him to agree to go on camera. And when he sat down and agreed to go on camera, it became one of the great classic 60 Minutes of all times. And if anyone is interested, you could go on YouTube. I think it has over 6 million views already. It became, because once when he decided to tell the story of his life and his father and what life was inside the mob, it was really quite an amazing experience. So we could talk forever, and I have so many stories in this book, and I hope people get a chance to read it. Certainly, you could pick it up on Amazon. I know it's pretty reasonably priced. But before I leave, a lot of people ask me, what have you learned from all the experiences you've had and all the people you've met? And what is it really you take away from this? And let me tell you what I've learned is you need to fix what you broke in terms of either things in the house, in terms of relationships, in terms of the planet. Leave the place better than when you came. Don't hold grudges. It'll dominate your being. Let it go. move forward, and keep your real friends close. Shed your bad relationships and try to talk to people that matter the most. Anyway, it was a great joy to be here tonight with everybody, and I can't wait to answer your questions. So, why don't we open it up a little bit, and then we could talk a little bit more about some of the things about 60 Minutes and certainly some of the things that I've experienced.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I'm going to open it up. I don't know if Kim, if you're getting questions or not, uh, but I've got one question up here that actually was on my list here. What is the one story that you wish you had done differently?
Great question. Um, I think the story that I probably, looking back, would have done a little bit differently was the story I did on Steve Bannon. I profiled Steve Bannon, and it took me 4 years to get John Gotti. It took me about 2 or 3 years of a budding relationship to do Steve Bannon. And when we ultimately did Steve Bannon, the night before we did it, and Steve Bannon would be, obviously, for people who don't remember, was the senior presidential advisor to Donald Trump, and he was a guy who ended up, on one hand, would be trashing Trump, saying, he doesn't read and now he doesn't listen. I mean, these are the things he would be telling me off camera. And then he would be talking about what a bunch of grifters are in the White House. And so when he finally agreed to go on camera after Trump fired him, I said to him the night before we were about to do this, have you decided to kill him or kiss him? And he said, I haven't figured it out yet. I said to him, brother, we got an interview in the morning. You better figure it out before the morning. And he decided to end up like praising Trump. So I think looking back on it, it turned out to be one of the all-time classic interviews of 60 Minutes history. It was an incredible interview. But looking back on it, I wish I had brought in some of the things that he told me in text messages. And in my book, probably the chapter I'm most proud of in many ways is the chapter on Steve Bannon, because I get into a lot of the details involving some of the things that he told us off camera. And one of the things he told us off camera, and again, I don't want to be political. I'm trying to avoid, I'm not saying I'm pro-Trump or anti-Trump or anything like that. I'm just laying out what he told me. And what he told me was he believed that Trump should be removed from office through the 25th Amendment. And he was trying to build up a certain support inside among the cabinet to remove Trump from office. And I put this in the book, and the full story is really in Ticking Clock. And it made a lot of news when it came out. I wish we had put some of that into the original piece that we did on the original interview. So that was one that I probably would have done a little bit differently.
Okay, I had a question about okay, you haven't talked about what you've done on the opioid crisis.
Oh, I do in my book.
I know you do.
Had quite a
I know
bit
you
into
do.
it. So let me tell you a little bit about that story. So one of the great things in journalism is when you could also collaborate with another body. And we were lucky enough, and I had done a number of collaborations over my career with the Washington Post, the most successful ones. And so we got together with the Washington Post and investigated the companies responsible for the opiate epidemic. And we did it over 5 separate segments. And just to brag for a moment, it became the single most award-winning piece in the 53-year history of 60 Minutes. It won every major award in TV. And what did we do? We told the story of a guy named Joe Renazizi, who was a top DEA official, who said that Congress neutered them at the height of the opiate epidemic and took all their powers of enforcement away. And a lot of these people who worked inside the Justice Department ended up working for the opiate industry. So what they would do is they all would create legislation or roadblocks that prevented the enforcement against the opiate industry, and then they took jobs with them. And so we tell the story, and we focused on one person in particular, Congressman Marino of Pennsylvania. And Marino was the one who created the legislation that took the DA's powers away. Well, lo and behold, what happened to Marino? He ended up getting nominated to be Donald Trump's new drug czar. And so that was the last line of the piece. And I still remember the phone call I got from a friend of mine who Mike Morrell, who was going to be CI director, had Hillary Clinton won. He was acting CI director. He's a really tough government official. He called me up and he said, "I did something tonight that I have never done before. I took my shoe off and threw it at the TV." Well, it turns out he wasn't the only one who did that, because within 3 days of the piece running, Donald Trump removed Marino from consideration of being drug czar. It literally, within the day after the piece appeared, Trump says, Marino is a good man. And I get a text from Bannon saying, whenever he says somebody's a good guy, that means he's toast. And sure enough, 3 days later, Trump removed him from consideration. So, and we ended up doing a series of stories about these companies, the McKesson Corporation and the Sackler family and things like that. And so I think if people are really interested, I get into some great detail in the book about it. But thank you for asking that question.
Yes. Yes. Okay. If we have one question here. Do you think that 60 Minutes owes its style to what Edward R. Murrow did in his special reports for CBS back in the 50s and 60s? Do you think they owe anything to Murrow?
Oh, absolutely. I think Murrow was groundbreaking in terms of the work that he did. I mean, he set the standard for everybody in terms of being a honorable and objective reporter. And also, more importantly, what really Murrow did was the courage he did in taking McCarthy on,
Yes.
at that time. And he was fearless in that regard. And it was not a popular thing to do. It would be, try to imagine, it would be like Republican congressmen and senators taking on Donald Trump, but times a factor of three, because what you're basically doing is by attacking McCarthy when Murrow did, it's in many ways saying, it's like people saying, "Oh, well, then you're pro-communist." I mean, that was kind of that was going on. And Don Hewitt was one of the producers of Murrow, and he learned a lot of the tricks and style, and also the courage that Murrow brought to the table when he went and created 60 Minutes. And what Don did was, Don used to do it with Murrow. He used to do these long, hour-long documentaries. And what he realized, and remember, this is the late 60s, what he
Right.
realized is that people's attention spans are getting smaller and smaller. So he said, let me give you 3 mini documentaries. Each one will be about 13 or 14 minutes. You may not like one, you may not even like two. I guarantee you're going to like the third. And so, this way, if you buy into a documentary, this is the subject, harvest of shame, and you got to buy into it, and it's a full hour. This way, Don gave you an investigative story, an issue story, pro-gun, anti-gun, or driving while old or not driving while old, and then he gave you, a kind of a laugh at the end with a nice Hollywood profile. So he kind of gave you a great poo-poo platter of stories that allowed you to really enjoy the program. But I think Don really learned a lot of that from Murrow.
Yes. Do you think that there are any uh, reporters today that can stand up to the kind of reporting that Murrow and maybe Walter Cronkite? I just always loved Walter Cronkite. Do you think that we have that kind of news today?
Well,
And
yeah, I mean, I think the last two correspondents I worked with were Bill Whitaker and Leslie Stahl.
Bill
and I think they're both extraordinary people. I mean, here's let me tell you about Leslie Stoll, for example. Leslie has been an incredible reporter over the years, but more importantly, she's been a great family person. And she has actually her daughter lives in LA and has blessed her with a granddaughter, and she's madly in love with her granddaughter and madly in love with her daughter. But but she's married to Aaron Lapham, who's been suffering a very debilitating illness, and she makes sure she leaves the office every day at 5 o'clock to be home and have dinner with him.
Wow.
And it doesn't matter if she's crashing a piece or not crashing a piece, she's out the door at 5 o'clock. Anybody who works with her knows that. And Bill Whitaker is somebody who will work night and day, backs his producers, supports his people, and also is a total gentleman, which is very unusual from the. If you read my book, that you can understand how unusual that is among correspondents. Um,
Yes. Yes.
he praises producers. He understands how they work. In fact, when he started, he said to me, and I get into this in my book a little bit about um, a lot of the correspondents who I've worked with, including, say, I'm not going to mention any names, you'll have to read the book, but they would diminish the role of producers and put them down. So Bill said to me at the beginning when we started to work, and he said, so let me get this straight. So you find the stories, you research it, you put the stories together, you investigate it, you put the stories, collaborate with me on these stories, we win all these awards, and then I'm supposed to shit on you, right? And I said, yeah, yeah, you got it. That's kind of the role. He says, okay, just want to understand how this place works. So yeah, you got it. So Bill kind of understood the absurdness of all that,
Hmm.
and and he's a great collaborator in doing stuff with.
I don't know how much time we have left. Why did 60 Minutes stop point counterpoint approach?
It's well, I think the easy answer is it's because of somebody named Andy Rooney. Andy Rooney came
I
along, and
loved
Andy
Andy
Rooney, yeah, everybody loved Andy Rooney, and Rooney would walk the hallways, and he'd wander in my office, and he was a big New York Giant fan, and he'd go to the Giant home games. His wife would prepare him little chicken soup in a little container. He'd board the train, cross the Hudson, get on, watch there. Have a upper bleacher seat, and he was a very genuine guy. He was also incredibly cheap, by the way. He and I once shared a cab, and it was a very long. We'd come from some lunch, and it was a fairly long cab ride. And he said to me, he said, "Give the guy a buck." I said, "Andy, you give a guy a buck in 1935. You don't give a guy a buck in 1995. I mean, come on, man. Well, how much you want to give him? $2?" So anyway, that was Andy, but Andy was an extraordinary voice. The hardest thing in a broadcast is figuring out how to get off the air, because what happens is the audience watches, and then if you see something called the minute by minutes, it drops completely. It's like falling off a cliff. And with Andy Rooney, the minute by minutes actually build when he came on. People actually tuned into 60 Minutes at the very end so that they could watch Andy Rooney. And so it was a remarkable loss when he left, because what happens is the end of a show, end of 60 Minutes builds the entire night for CBS. So if you suddenly are losing your entire audience, you're not giving the next show any audience to build on. So what Andy Rooney did was he was priceless because he actually helped launch the entire night of CBS.
Well, I think that is probably, we're supposed to end at 8 o'clock and our time, and it's 7:54 now. I mean, I could sit here and ask you questions for hours, and you have such an interesting life and so much good stuff to talk about. And so I really want to thank you for being here and for doing this for us. It was really interesting. Um,
Well, thank
and
you so much for having me. Listen, and I'm serious about this. If
Yes,
people buy the book, you get my mother's kugel recipe. I'm telling you, I've gotten feedback from people who've made this recipe.
I have the book right
There's,
here. It was a fascinating book. I mean, I read it so fast, um, and I really enjoyed it. And I think everybody should. I'm your biggest cheerleader here.
well, if they show you the book, you give them the kugel recipe. I'm going to send it to you,
Okay,
and
give me
it
the
comes
Google
a big hit.
recipe. Me who can't boil water. Yes.
That's all right. That's all right. You get the kugel recipe, but you also get the book. So anyway, thank you so much for having me tonight.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. All right. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Ira. This was a really interesting, and thank you, Amy Rowe and Marlon Martinez, for your delightful musical journey on clocks and time. Ira Rosen's book is right there. See where my finger is? Okay. Um, and signed Ira Rosen's book and signed book plates are available at Vroman's Bookstore, our official community partner and bookseller for the 2021 book festival. You can also order the book via a link from our Zoom email, from the Federation website where you registered, or directly from Romans. And also, of course, you can order it from Amazon. This was the last of the certainly memorable 2021 Jewish Federation Book Festival. The challenges have been many, but the committee and the Federation staff have been up to the task, don't you think? Here's to next year when we will present the 2022 Book Festival. And a big thank you to our loyal audience, whose numbers keep growing despite the adversities we've worked to overcome. So, thanks everybody. See you next year.